everybody. As Lee said, I'm Dale Skaggs, Director of Horticulture here at the Dixon Gallery and Gardens. And it's kind of bittersweet that I'm introducing Adam for his final Munch and Learn as a Dixon employee. Adam is moving on to greener things. So this is his last Munch and Learn as an official Dixon staff member. And we've really enjoyed working with Adam. I think everybody on staff has enjoyed him. Hardworking, and he's got a real laid back, pleasant attitude that I think everyone appreciates. You know, gardeners, I've always said gardeners are sort of lifelong learners. They're always trying to learn more, and you never can know everything in the world of horticulture. And Adam is sort of takes that to the next level. He has taken classes from Dr. Elaine Ingham out of Corvallis, Oregon, remotely for the soil food web, where he has become he can tell you a little bit more about it, but he is actually certified to be a consultant on the soil food web, telling you what beneficial organisms you have and how to cultivate more of these organisms. He's a staunch believer in starting with the soil, and that makes all the difference in gardening, and that's very, very true, especially here in Memphis with our heavy clay soil. He came to us as basically a farmer, a small scale urban farmer, but he's actually grown row crops as well. And in his time here at the Dixon, we've implemented a lot of new practices. We've rekindled our composting program, and he's taught us about cover crops and a lot of organic gardening. I think he really adheres to sort of the Rodale methods of gardening, which are very a lot of them are old techniques, but there's a rekindled interest in them. So anyway, Adam is going to be growing flowers of another sort. So anyway, without any further ado, I will give you Adam Queen.
Hello, thanks, Dale. So yeah, I gotta share the screen. And there we go. So yeah, my name is Adam Queen. I'm a horticulturalist here at the Dixon. Hang on, I'm trying to get this all situated. That'll work. Okay. So yeah, horticulturist here at the Dixon. I'm also a certified soil food web technician, where it's actually, I'm in the consultant training program, so I'm not allowed to consult yet, but I can look at your soil compost or compost tea under a microscope and tell you what beneficial organisms are there and what plants they will support. I was going to put wildcraft extraordinaire on here, but I took it off, but I'm going to say it anyway, because I'm really adhere to like trying to work with nature, not against nature kind of a thing. I understand that there is need for synthetic fertilizers and pesticides in some instances, but I feel like those things can be more detrimental than beneficial in 75% of the cases that we're using them. So we're going to talk about cover crops today, kind of go over what cover crops are, what some beneficial uses are, and how you might be able to incorporate them on a small scale, and hopefully realize that they're not just for big agricultural practices. All right, so what are cover crops? Cover crops are a group of plants that are useful for building soil. They create habitat for insects and create organic biomass. Cover a vast spectrum of plants. Each has their own benefit. It's definitely not a cure-all, and it's not something that you can just try one thing and it might work. You kind of have to know like set and setting and how to take that forward. But in some cases they are, well, when used correctly, they are a long proven strategy for building soils. They support ecology both above and below the soil. But truly what a cover crop is, I mean, it can be anything. It can be fava bean, it can be Sunn Hemp, it can be clay peas. In most cases that we're familiar with, it's usually overwintered rye, wheat, or oats mixed with some sort of legume like vetch or clover. And really just a cover for the soil over the winter is how it's been popularized. But there are some summer players that need to be mentioned, I think. So just go over the brief history of it. Our ancestors used cover crops and they knew that it worked. I mean, we've been using cover crops for a millennium, but we just didn't understand what they were doing. We just knew they worked. I've read some cases of where when pioneers would clear the forests, they would come back with buckwheat because it did well in poor soils. Because when you clear a forest, you're left with basically nothing. You know, you've taken it all the way back to the clay subsoil, most likely. But it was also a food source for them. Let's see, all the way back to the Egyptians, the ancient man, they rotated wheat and other grains as a cover crop. So it's just something that you can add into rotation, that you're not just planting the same thing over and over again. The soil is always covered. It's never bare, because the earth honestly does not like bare soils. And we'll kind of get into, I'll kind of hint on the microbial aspect of what that means. Try not to dive too deep into it, but yeah. All right, so cover crops, this is traditionally, when you think of cover crops, this is what you think. You think of big tractors, planters, roller crimpers going over 6-foot stands of perennial ryegrass, because they have been shown to have, they are very beneficial, because what farmers have done in recent years, probably since the 30s or 40s, they'll just plow up the ground after the harvest in the fall, let it sit, and then all winter we get the heavy rains, and that's where the erosion comes in, and that's where the NRCS was formed, and they realized, hey, we're losing all of our soil, and we probably should do something about it before it's just completely gone, and we can't do anything about it. So yeah, they prevent erosion, they increase soil organic matter layer, suppress weeds, sequester carbon from the atmosphere, and that's just a fancy term for photosynthetic process where they pull carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere for photosynthesis and release oxygen, which is kind of interesting because, you know, the carbon load, you typically don't think of carbon as CO2, but there is, you know, 1 carbon for every 2 oxygen molecules. They increase the soil microbiome, and some species actually pull nitrogen from the atmosphere. And this has been of great interest to agricultural centers because of the fact that nitrogen is mobile in the soil, and it's hard to keep around because it is so soluble. All right, so let's dive a little bit deeper into each topic here. So preventing soil erosion. So it kind of acts like a mat. It's kind of like a plant material, because if you think about it, if you just have bare soil, I know everybody's seen this, when it rains 6 inches like it can in the wintertime in a day around here, you're typically left with like basically small creeks running through pieces of land. And if the root structure is not there to hold on to something, that land just washes out, and it just perpetually happens if there's not something there. So the roots can penetrate very deep. They create an increased pore structure in the soil, leading to greater water infiltration. So this is something like rye or oats, some type of grass. They're kind of like scavengers in the plant family. They're kind of like the first things that come around in succession, because if you notice, if you have a garden and you till, you have a new plot, what's the first thing that comes back? Grass, and probably pigweed around here. But those are the things that they don't require a whole lot of nutrient accumulation from the soil, because the soil is not able to support larger plant life in that newest form that it's in right now. So what happens is, since the roots go down, the plants die, you kind of have this natural cycle happening. So if you cut the top of the plant, you leave the roots in the ground, what's going to happen to the roots? The microbiology is going to move in, hopefully if they're there, and break down the roots. And if you don't till it, those roots create structure in the soil that water can infiltrate into. I hope that makes sense. So it's kind of like you have a root, it rots, now you got a tiny micro hole that water can get into. It also benefits, like it makes earthworms easier to move around, the microarthropods, which are just microscopic insects, and just creates better soil structure. Because what happens is, if you just have bare ground, and you've probably seen this, if you till a ground and it's just clay, it's just red dirt, which is mostly what we have around here, because all the topsoil has been worked off, and it rains, the first time it just turns into soup, and all that clay just compacts on top of each other. I won't get into the how that happens molecularly, but it's kind of like, it's called flocculating, where each clay particle essentially just does this. It just packs on top of each other. And there's no room for oxygen to get in. There's no room for roots to penetrate. It's just clay. But the trade-off is clay is very good at holding minerals and nutrients. So if you have plants that can access that subsoil layer and bring nutrients to the surface, this is how they kind of cycle nutrients. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. Yeah. Earth does not like bare soil. All right, so I found a few pictures on a larger scale, what erosion can look like. And I've heard stories from my dad about like whenever he was farming about how gullies would wash out and stuff, because, you know, they would pull a plow and like plow it up every fall. They would just be bare. And this is kind of what you're left with. And where I'm from, there are a lot of hills like this that are farmed. And I've had to fill in many gullies with a plow before, and it's not fun. Yeah, and these are kind of extreme cases. I understand that, you know, this might not be on a gardening level, but it kind of makes you think the importance of ground cover and not just bare soil. All right, so let's get into soil fertility. This one's kind of one of my favorite topics to talk about, just because of the nutrient cycling process that can happen with biology. But okay, so the cover crops help manage macro and micronutrients, and the nutrients are held in their biomass, not in soluble fertilizer form. So I hear a lot of people talk about how cover crops make nutrients. Well, they do kind of, but it's not in the sense that most people actually think. So when you think about nutrients, typically we've been throwing something like Osmocote down, or, you know, something that's like water soluble, something that nitrogen's bound to, you know, a chloride molecule or something that when water comes into play, that nitrogen comes off of that molecule and is now attached to that water molecule. That's not what cover crops do. They don't create nitrogen ions in the soil. They don't create potassium ions. They don't create plant available ions in the soil. What's happening is they're mining these nutrients that might be in other organic forms, and they're storing them in their bodies. So matter cannot be neither created nor destroyed. So these ions are present, well, not as ions, because they're bound up in the plant's biology. So when you grow a plant like that, let it die on top of the ground, the nutrients are still in there, they're just locked up. That's where the microbiology comes into play. The microbiology comes in and actually shreds them down, breaks them apart, all the way from, you say, a microarthropod that's able to shred an organic molecule down to, you know, a nematode that's able to eat a protozoa or a fungi, and the nutrient cycling process just starts happening that way. Let's see. So yes, there's a particular interest in synthesis of nitrogen by legumes because of nitrogen solubility in water. What this means is that every time you water, if there is nitrogen in the ground in form of most likely NO3, which is nitrate, it can be an ammonia. There's this whole process of ammonia, nitrate, nitrite, and then it goes back into the atmosphere as N2, just gas, nitrogen gas. So what happens is if you have an NO3 compound, it's water soluble. So when you water, that compound is bound to that water molecule again, kind of like we talked about earlier. And as that water, and if you have all these erosion problems, you have this lack of water infiltration, and all of your water just running out of your garden, and you're putting down all these fertilizers, you are leaching off nitrates. And that's the premise behind the Gulf of Mexico right now. We're putting down too many synthetic fertilizers on the fields up and down the Delta, all the way, you know, Mississippi River Valley, everywhere, all the way up and down. And every time it rains, it washes off. Because, I mean, I can break it down a little bit further. I hope people are following this, but it takes, for every 1 pound of nitrogen, you get 1 bushel of acre of corn. So what they do is they'll put down 200 pounds of nitrogen per acre, shooting for 200 bushels of corn. You might get that. Most often I see farmers average around 150, 160, 170, and they're like, well, where'd the rest of my nitrogen go? Well, it went to the Gulf of Mexico. So, I mean, is it really worth it to spread 200 pounds of nitrogen if you're only averaging 160 bushels an acre over a 5-year period? kind of doesn't make sense, but that's the way it is. Okay, I'll get off that soapbox. So where green manure comes from is that it's a manure in green form. I mean, essentially, it kind of says what it is. So when you grow it for biomass, something like rye, wheat, it's green. It's essentially, one instance is people would till it in. So you would grow it, you would till it into the soil, but it kind of messes up with the microbiome. And there's kind of a whole theory around like, don't till it at all, we'll leave it on the surface and it'll break down. But then, in a garden setting, it's kind of hard to plant into. There's different methods we can talk about, try to get into a little bit later about this, but that's where it's like, it's not a cure-all, and you kind of have to figure out what works best for your setting. All right, so the enhancement of the soil structure. Over time, cover crops enhance soil structure by increasing soil organic matter layer, which increases water holding capacity, nutrient cycling, and the beneficial microorganisms. This is kind of what we talked about earlier. When we leave the biomass on top to break down using the chop and drop method, that's essentially, you just have like a 5 foot tall stand of wheat or rye, something like that, come in, chop it, put it down, and there you have mulch essentially, and you can like spread it out, plant into that. There's a specific time you want to do that. It's called the milk stage, where it's set flower, it's just about to set seed. Most of the time, if you can cut it at the crown, it's basically terminated, and it's going to have a hard time to come back. Yeah, we talked about the root systems. They stay in the soil, breaking down and creating porous layers for water infiltration. Yeah, so the organic matter layer is kind of important because you're building, so there's different horizons. I think I talked about this in the last lecture, but there's different horizons. So basically what we're seeing around here mostly is just clay. Well, there's supposed to be like a 2 to 4 inch horizon of organic matter, and that's where the microbiology kind of lives and cycles nutrients, breaks down things. And that's kind of where you're getting to the building structure with biomass. Because if you kind of think about how a natural pasture forms and cycles every year, all of that green growth comes to the top, and what we would think is a weedy field dies back, comes back again in the spring, dies back, comes back again. All of that dead matter is just building and building and building on top of each other. All right, so the creation of aerobic soil conditions. So we talked about the increased soil porosity through the breakdown of organic matter in the form of roots. I mean, so what's happening is whenever you have all that building of soil structure, you have a porous root zone. What you're getting is an aerobic condition, which is just a fancy term for increased oxygen. And this favors aerobic microbial respiration, which is healthy respiration. So when a land goes fallow, that's when you get the compaction layers. That's when you get, over time, lack of oxygen, stuff like that. Because I've seen fields where you would have to plow them just because when you did plow them in the spring from the heavy rains and compaction all winter long, it would just smell like a sewer. It would smell like sulfur. So what you're smelling there is the anaerobic breakdown of organic matter. And what that is kind of interesting, because the bacteria is mostly a bacterial process, and they're not able to utilize oxygen for their respiration. What they're doing is they're using glucose, I think, and what they're actually putting off is ethyl alcohol, which is toxic to plants. It is toxic to humans in larger forms, but it's what we know is in beer or wine. Just don't drink too much and you'll be okay. But it's one little bit is toxic to roots. So you can kind of see where, oh, okay, well, now we've got this compaction issue. We got this anaerobic microbial population, and this is where something like cover crops can really help out. All right, so weed management. Again, this is not a cure-all, and you kind of have to know how to work it, but it does suppress weeds and thick stands. So traditionally, what's been done is to plant a mixture of wheat, rye, clover, vetch, things like this, like a mixture of grasses and legumes, maybe a brassica or two like daikon or turnip, plant them around September to middle October. That's the cutoff. You really want a good month before frost, which is usually November 15th, November 30th-ish. This year was a little different, as I think subsequent years will be, but you can't really tell. So plant them in the fall. They come up, they really outcompete the winter weeds, because the winter weeds, like the low growing, like chickpea or henbed, stuff like that, it doesn't really get that tall, and they're very tender. They don't have much structure to them. So when you have a good stand of grass that can make it through the winter, once spring comes, that grass is already established. It's going to shoot up and grow if you let it go into the summer. I mean, oats is very easy to save seeds on, so you can let it go to the summer, save the seeds on those. And if you don't, as long as you don't till it and you figure out how to terminate it, you've suppressed a whole round of weeds, because weed seeds are dormant up to, I think, below 3 inches in the soil. And that's kind of where the whole tiller thing is kind of has been an issue, because every time you till, you're bringing up new weed seed below 3 inches that have been dormant in the soil. And some weed seeds can be dormant for tens of years. They can they can survive quite a long time. One other practice is, so when you flatten the biomass, so that's where if you see something with a tractor, a roller crimper, which is just a large drum either on the front of the tractor or behind the tractor. In the milk stage, you crimp it and you're cutting it right at the crown above the soil. And that creates literally what is a living mulch. When you crimp it, becomes a dead mulch. So it's kind of like spreading straw in your garden. So you're kind of getting two benefits out of this, where you get the root zone that's going to break down and have organic matter in the soil, as well as you have this biomass above the ground in the garden bed that you can just crimp. And you don't have to have big fancy machinery. I've seen people do it with a 2x4 and a string, where the string is placed on opposite ends of the 2x4 and you just step on it. Another method, if you're not comfortable with crimping it like that, is just to just chop and drop it whenever the seed head starts to form. Or you can take it to the compost pile if you want to compost it. There's lots of options to play around with in the garden. Certain species possess allelopathy. I'm not good at saying that word. I probably never will be, but it's basically a fancy term for a compound that inhibits the germination of seeds. Rye is a really good one for this. There are several studies out where farmers have planted rye before corn, or planted corn after rye, and 2 weeks there was a actual decrease in yield compared to 4 weeks. And they think that it has to do with this compound that the grass is releasing, which kind of makes sense, because some plants can be adventitious and bullish in nature, and kind of want to take over and spread for themselves. And they're just taking, let's see. All right, so disease and pest management. So the good thing about putting cover crops in the garden is that, one, they create habitat. So not only are you decreasing erosion, you're also increasing habitat for beneficial insects. So, and it's kind of, let's see, hang on. Yeah, so by increasing beneficial soil, microorganism biomass, hasn't been proven, but I think it's been and I could be wrong, there might be a paper out there, but currently it's theorized that it suppresses something like pathogenic fungi or nematodes by an increased beneficial microbial population. There have been several studies on mustards actually releasing compounds as well that suppress fungal and root knot nematode. Also, yes, creating the beneficial habitat for insects. All right. So yeah, now we've kind of gone over the benefits of everything. Let's kind of talk about more in detail of particular cover crops you could plant in your garden. So I've kind of broke them down into tillers, nitrogen fixers, and green manure and biomass. Tillers are being something that has a long taproot that's easy to grow, and that's mostly in the brassica family. You could say, well, carrots have a long taproot, but carrots don't like compacted soils very well, unless you're growing oxheart, which is like maybe a 4-inch diameter on a 1-inch carrot. It's good, but it's, you know, kind of been bred to grow more compacted soils. So these include things like purple top turnip, Daikon radish, and even perennial ryegrass. I'm going to include in this category with these because in certain circumstances, ryegrass has been documented to go down to 20 feet into the soil. And that's really where you can kind of think of, that's where all your micronutrients are. It's pulling it out of those clay layers. Your nitrogen fixers are going to be members of the legume family. With the aid of Rhizobacter bacteria, they actually pull nitrogen gas from the atmosphere and convert it into ammonium that's stored in their root system. So this is kind of where we talked about earlier, the whole nitrification process of, yeah, they create nutrients, but it's not in the form that you might think. And without the proper microbiology in place, it's locked up and it's just going to sit there. So healthy legume plants are going to have this red nodule on their root system, and it's kind of producing the same thing I think hemoglobin is, but it's, I mean, it's unmistakable when you pull up these plants and you're like, that's ammonium. That's where the nitrogen is being stored. And without that, some soils have it, some soils don't. And, you know, most of these things just, we used to think, oh, it would just blow in on the wind. And frankly, we found that's not the case. So if you are going to plant legumes, I would highly recommend a inoculant. There are several companies that are able to isolate these colonies of bacteria, and it's very easy to put it on the seed before you plant or water it in after you plant, and you're making sure that your bacterial colonies are there that you need to convert that process. So green manure and biomass, these are going to be your cool season grasses that thrive in poor soils and can be overwintered. These are things like oats, annual rye, wheat. If you're going to grow rye in your garden, I would recommend annual rye over perennial rye, unless you want a lot of work ahead of you, because perennial rye, the way that it grows in a large crown, and it's really hard to get rid of. Annual ryegrass grows kind of like your typical grasses, you know, single blade form, and it's a lot easier to terminate. But the trade-off for perennial ryegrass is that it's going to go twice as deep into the soil as annual rye. So if you're having some extreme problems with compaction, I would try out the perennial rye on a smaller scale and see kind of how you work with it before committing, you know, a 50 by 50 plot of just perennial ryegrass. Because I tried that one time with a tiller and tried to till it in, did not go over so well. All right, so individually, let's kind of talk about them a little bit. Daikon radish, and this is your typical Daikon radish that you will see at in grocery stores. Typically used for ferments mostly, not a lot of flavor. I mean, you can eat it raw, it's okay. It definitely doesn't have that spice of something, say, like a breakfast radish or your round Easter egg radish types. But definitely it's really good for ferments and storage through the winter months. Great for soil compaction. I've seen these things be over 12 inches, probably a foot, 2 foot. I wouldn't say 2 foot, maybe a foot and a half at the most. They can get pretty big. And the benefit of these is that, especially if you leave it in the garden to rot, so it's going to make a big hole, maybe like 2 inches in diameter. So when it rots, it's left this giant hole in the ground. And that's where your water infiltration comes on, and also your oxygenation. And it's edible. Like I said, the leaves are edible too. They're pretty good. They're pretty mild. They're not very spicy. They're good in salads and stuff like that. I've tried cooking them before. They cook down way too fast. They don't stand up as well as kale or something like that. Okay, so let's move on to purple top turnip. This is a Southern classic. I'm pretty sure everyone knows what this is. Similar to Daikon, but it doesn't have, it's more of a bulbous root structure with a taproot at the bottom attached to it, instead of just a long cylindrical root like Daikon. But, you know, it has the taproot. It does well in poor soils. kind of the same thing, increases soil porosity. It's also edible. It's just awesome by itself. I'll just cook it up in the skillet with salt and pepper, and that's it. I mean, all right. So let's get into mustards. And this one here is kind of fun. I really like this one. This is called red giant mustard or giant red mustard. It gets huge. It doesn't like the cold as well as some other mustards, but in the springtime, if you can time it just right, it is great in the garden. There's also another cultivar called Osaka Purple that Kitazawa Seed Company sells. And that is the spiciest mustard I've ever had in my life. It's delicious. The spice actually cooks out when you cook it. So just fair warning, or if you don't like the spice, cook it. But it's kind of fun. But like we said before, it's very beneficial for pest management. You know, that spice character is going to kind of carry over with insects, and saying that, you know, if it's kind of burning you a little bit, it's probably burning the pests as well. Oh, and it's very good for if you let any of these brassicas go to flower. It's kind of complicated if you want to save seed because they cross-pollinate really easy. I think you want like 200 feet between what you're trying to save, like say a daikon that's going to flower and a mustard that's going to flower in the same garden. If they flower at the same time, most likely they're going to cross-pollinate. But if you're not saving seed, you know, no big deal. Crazy sidebar. But yeah, they're very good for insects in the springtime because they'll typically, when it gets hot, about late May, they'll start sending up flowers. And the flowers are edible as well. So if you let the stem, you can just eat the whole stem, really. All right, so let's get into clovers. This is in the legume family that cycles nitrogen from the atmosphere with the aid of bacteria that's there that may or not be there. So I'm just saying, use inoculants. So white clover is good for, it's a low growing perennial, typically comes back every year. And this one's kind of fun because it can take high traffic areas. So if you have like raised bed gardens out in your yard or something, and you're tired of mowing and you want something, you know, a little bit more beneficial on the ground in between your garden beds, this is a good option, white clover, right in between the garden beds. And you can, you know, if you want to mow the white clover, just mow it, pick it up, put it on top of your garden bed. It's going to have a little bit more nitrogen than something like rye or wheat or something. So it's a good mulch that'll feed your garden as well. Mammoth red clover, this one is quite bullish. It can grow to 2 to 3 feet and be a thick mass, but it is quite beautiful when it blooms, and the bees go nuts over it. It has the mammoth red clover also has a longer taproot than these other clovers, so it's also good when paired with something like ryegrass or oats or something to go down there and actually penetrate that subsoil layer. Medium red clover, it's kind of like in between white clover and mammoth red clover. It's low growing, but you also get those pretty red flowers. And also all these clovers are actually medicinal. There's lots of sources that you can look into is making teas out of the mammoth red clover. Okay, so hairy vetch. This actually grows wild around here on roadsides. And it's really pretty, puts out this purple flower in the fall. And again, it's a super awesome early pollinator that bees and predatory wasps will be attracted to. But typically you can sow this in with, I wouldn't sow this by itself on a large scale, maybe like, well, because it vines. So you want something that this is going to like kind of climb up, or else it's just kind of going to sprawl on the ground. So I've planted this with rye and wheat before, and it's done really well. And it didn't get to the point where it overtook the rye or the wheat. It just kind of created this symbiotic biomass. But again, this is also a really good nitrogen fixing plant. Let's see. All right. So Austrian Winter Pea, this is another legume. The pea shoots and flowers are edible, like just maybe like the top 3 inches of the plant. The bottom gets a little bit too porous and it's not that good and sweet, but the flowers are edible. This is something you can grow in your garden and, you know, make salad. Most of these things are edible that you can make salads off of. So, okay, let's move on to oats. Again, this is something that you can sow in the fall. it's kind of a toss up if we'll make it here. I've had good success growing oats in the city. I've not had good success growing oats overwintered in the country. And I think it has to do with just the cold and also just the wind chill. But yeah, so this has really good root structure. I've also seen articles that oats have a better pairing with mycorrhizal fungi than rye or wheat. So if you're trying to build fungal populations in your soil, this is a good one to go to. And this one is really easy to save seed from year after year once you get a good stock going. And again, so you can see in this picture, as long as you took care of the seeds, like I can see this one's going to seed. If you cut it before it went to seed, I mean, just imagine all that mulch straw that you have now that you wouldn't have to buy in the wintertime. Okay, so annual rye. This one, I mean, as you can see here, it creates a ton of biomass. I've driven a truck through a field trying to get to a sprayer before, and it was probably 10, 12 foot tall. Like I couldn't, it was like driving through a forest. But the root structure, like I said, it goes down 20 feet. Awesome plant. Really does good in poor soils. Wheat, you know, everyone knows wheat. It's a good addition to the fall garden, even in small plots, you know, little 4x4 area of wheat planting, you know, have some fun, save some seed for next year. Also highlight, there are several varieties of wheat that are kind of heirloom and forgotten about. Something like einkorn, which is thought to be the closest relative to wild wheat that we have. It's been documented that the Egyptians grew einkorn. It's supposed to be like the gluten content is supposed to be a lot less, and people that have gluten intolerances are supposed to be able to have an easier time digesting this. So it's just something to look into. All right, so let's get into the summer plants. So buckwheat, this is a good one. You're going to want to wait till about May or June to plant this. Past June, though, it gets too hot around here for this plant. And I've also noticed that this plant, it likes a higher organic matter layer. And I think that has to do, honestly, with the water holding capacity. But the buckwheat that I planted in May or June has fared a lot better than buckwheat that I planted late June and July. And I think that's just because it didn't have enough time to get its roots into the ground and start pulling moisture up before the heat and the drought of July and August start setting in. I've grown a 1/4 acre of this stuff before, and the bees and predatory wasps love this stuff. I mean, it's a great addition to the garden. It's also really short-lived. So it goes to flower in 10 or 12 weeks. So if you have a spot in your garden in the summertime that something didn't work out, you know, you had to pull some plants out because of disease or something, and got some buckwheat on hand, you throw that buckwheat in there and it'll do just fine. All right, so iron and clay peas, these are a lesser predecessor to black-eyed peas, but they're very heat and drought tolerant. It's one reason why black-eyed peas are so popular around here is because they're heat and drought tolerant. They tolerate poor soils. But the interesting thing is this clay pea is actually a legume. So this is something that can pull nitrogen out of the atmosphere and store it in its root systems to be broken down later. It's really good for attracting pollinators. It's a very easy plant to grow. Sorghum Sudan grass, this is actually a hybrid between sorghum and Sudan grass. I mean, you can get the Sudan grass itself. I think this one hybridized is actually a smaller version, because if you just plant Sudan grass by itself, it can get up to probably 6 feet, 8 feet. It creates a ton of biomass. But it's really heat tolerant, good for the soils. You have a ton of mulch, or if you want to make a compost pile in the middle of the summer and you're having problems getting hold to green material, this is a great one to add to the garden. Let's see, Sunn Hemp. And this is not regular cannabis. This is a whole nother cultivar. I probably should have put the scientific name on here, but I've forgotten it. But this is popular in tropical regions. Interesting note is that this plant will not set seed above the southern part of Texas. So this far north is not going to set seed. I've grown this on a hillside before, and it had no organic matter layer, just clay on the side of a hill, no irrigation, and it got 6 feet plus. I just kept it weeded real well. But the taller you let this get, it gets very fibrous. So it is hard to process the taller it gets. So just keep that in mind. But it is also a legume that is a summer option. All right, so just real quick, kind of go over how you could maybe get started in applying cover crops in your garden. So cover crops are great garden soils that are compacted and have low organic matter content. So if you have an area of the garden where it's holding a lot of water, or water's running off, or maybe an area of the garden where you have a spot that you just have to keep watering continuously through the summertime, you might have a compaction issue. And these are some plants that you may be able to plant that will help care that without having to do a lot of digging, without having to do a lot of work. Yeah, so it's a one size fits all. I would kind of look into it a little bit more, read about it, but also too, gardening is fun. So if you have an area of the garden, I would start with a cover crop mix from like a seed company or something. They're typically going to have like a grass, like wheat or rye. They're going to have a legume. They're going to have some sort of brassica in there, and just sow that out, see what happens. Yeah. So for fall planting, that's going to be stuff like your brassicas, your wheat, your rye, oats, vetches all over winter. Trying to think what else. So the window for that is around September 1st to October 15th. After October 15th, you're really not getting that sort of biomass that you're looking for to get it covered through the winter, because you're wanting a pretty thick stand where it's going to look like over the winter time, it's going to look like kind of a green carpet in your garden. And that's going to help with water infiltration. It's going to slow the water down. It's going to help with compaction because the water, when it rains really, really heavy, that green mat kind of disperses the water and it just doesn't beat the garden soil up too much. Yeah, I've tried to sow stuff in August before because brassicas, they'll germinate in temperatures of 80, 85 degrees, but they don't like to grow in 80 or 85 degrees once they germinate. So September is usually a safe time to start it. There is an interesting thing you could play around with called winter kill, where around August, things that will germinate in hot temperature and take hot temperatures and kind of like slow down as the cooler season of fall starts approaching, is like clay peas, sorghum, Sudan grass, buckwheat. So you get them up to maybe about a foot and a half tall if you plant them in August. And then around November 15th, when the frost comes, you have all that biomass that's going to frost kill. And in the garden, that stuff will frost kill and just fall on top of the soil. And then you kind of have a dead mat that's helping protect the soil as well. All right, so when to plant in the summer, you can start some stuff in April 15th, but usually like the hotter stuff like buckwheat or Sunn Hemp, the clay peas, they want to start around May or June. They really need that higher temperature to germinate and grow. If you're in a pinch and you actually want to start some cover crops this spring to grow through, they'll ripen maybe like June or July. You can start them in March, like March 1, March 15th, kind of that window. All right, so how to plant. The easiest thing to do with this is honestly to broadcast it. So if you have a garden bed, I would kind of like get your weeds out of there that you don't want and kind of scratch it up a little bit. So that way you'll get good seed to soil contact. Outspread, typically it's like 2 to 4 pounds per 1,000 square feet, which I'll kind of break down the economics of it in the next slide. It's really cheap. You probably won't need 2 to 4 pounds. Usually like it's a pound or even a quarter pound for a little garden bed will do. So yeah, after that, I would, you got your soil scratched, go ahead and broadcast it and then just cover it lightly with compost or something with the consistency of like leaf mold. And that's going to help it germinate, keep the moisture in, and then even put some straw lightly on top of that, or maybe like some wood chips or something. But that leaf mold is really going to help hold the soil moisture and help them germinate. What I've typically done is if I had a big garden plot, I would do like a light tillage just to scratch that surface so I could get that seed to soil contact. Broadcast the seeds, throw the seed out, do a light tillage again, maybe like an inch just to mix that. Another good option is to, once you spread the seed and you have that seed to soil contact, just kind of like tamp it down. Typically in agriculture, they'll use something like, it's kind of like a roller crimper. Basically, it's just called a roller. It's like this big weight rolling wheel that you pull behind the tractor, and that presses the seed into the soil. So you have that seed to soil contact. So yeah, just real quick, 5 by 20 foot space, 100 square feet, according to 2 to 4 pounds per 1,000 square feet, you're looking at 0.2 pounds. So roughly a quarter pound, and if it comes out to $6.85 a pound, you're only looking at $1.71 per 100 square feet. So, I mean, you could break it down per square foot and be basically like decimals of pennies on the dollar, I guess. So just wanted to kind of touch on the benefit of multi-species, wrapping it up here. There's several articles if you want to get on Google Scholar. There's several collegiate documented articles that recommend multi-species plantings over single species plantings. And I kind of am in this boat because the more diversity you have, the more diversity you're going to attract. So if you're only going after one crop, you might be, or one monoculture, say just wheat or rye. I mean, if you're saving it for seed, that makes sense. But if you're trying to increase soil structure, increase microbial diversity in your soil, increase insect habitat, I mean, I would throw everything in the kitchen sink at it that would grow in that time frame. Yeah, and kind of went over the oats and the mycorrhizal, how it's been shown. So yeah, I think every lecture I'm going to give, I'm going to tell everyone to read Jeff Lowenfeld's books, just because they're awesome. And also like Mycorrhizal Planet. And I know these aren't books on like cover crops or how to do cover crops and, the ins and outs of cover crops, but it kind of shows you the importance of, what we don't see below the soil and what these cover crops are doing in their root zone. Yeah, so I think that's the end.
Well, thank you, Adam. That was great. There are a few questions. First, I have a question. Are cover crops always planted according to what the soil needs, or is wildlife taken into consideration also?
It's a little bit of both. I think there's a trade-off for both, because I know the NRCS is real big on like even planting for food plots for deer and quail and stuff like that through the winter time. So yeah, I would say both, because it's just good to just consider everybody in the situation.
Okay, and Tatiana has a question. She says, can I use cover crop in my kitchen garden in the fall? Which cover crop would work best so I can plant vegetables again in spring?
Okay, if you wanted to get rid of it in spring, I mean, are you talking like if you're wanting to plant like radishes or broccoli or something like that, I would kind of just mulch it, because most of these cover crops that you plant in the fall are going to go through that kind of March. They're not going to wake up again until March, and that's kind of when you plant your winter garden. But if you're going for summer garden, yeah, I would do like the rye, the wheat, vetch, daikon, turnips, mustards, stuff like that, and terminate it about April sometime. And in a small garden, you can kind of like pull them up and do your little, like do a weeding routine that you have and plant right behind it. Just, it'll do just fine.
Tatiana, do you have any other questions about that?
Well, I was just wondering, because I usually cover my garden beds with cardboard, and then I put some leaf mold, mulched leaves on top of it, and then I wait until spring. Yeah. So I was just wondering whether one or the other is better, just talking about the kitchen garden.
Yeah.
Or any kind of garden that we, most of us would have in our yards.
Yeah, I think they both have their place. I think I really am a fan of the mulch with cardboard and leaf mold on top because it suppresses weeds and stuff. And earthworms really like that kind of habitat to live in. So that's where I was saying, like, if you want to go for a winter garden, I would probably do the cardboard mulch because you can pull it up faster. Whereas it might, the winter rye or wheat or something like that might go a little bit further past where you want to have that target planting of that. Because something like, if you're going to plant sweet potatoes, you can wait till mid-May, late May to plant those. So that's plenty of time for like something like a grass to live in your garden. Does that make sense?
Thank you. Yes, yes.
Well, Suzanne had a comment. She said that she loves daikon and it's good in stews. So everybody, it's good in stews too. And when you say that the vetch is a nitrogen fixer, does that mean that just by growing it in the soil, it helps nitrogen, or does that mean when you mulch it into the soil, it helps the nitrogen?
So it's going to have a higher nitrogen content in its body source as well. But the focus mainly up till now has been on its ability to fix nitrogen in its root zone, where it's stored as ammonium. So it's kind of the whole thing of where if you leave the roots in the ground and you don't till it, you have that root nodule that's full of ammonium that a nitrifying bacteria can get a hold of and convert into a plant available form of nitrate, if that makes sense.
And also, you're talking about predatory wasps. That sounds really bad, but I assume that predatory wasps were a good thing.
I'm allergic to, I have a good story about this. I'm allergic to wasps. I'm deathly afraid of wasps. If I get stung on my hand, I will swell up past my elbow. So this last season, I had a bunch of mustard that I let just go to seed, let the bugs have it and all that stuff. And I had a red wasp nest, and one of them actually stung me. And he knew he did it because he was very malicious about it. Because he would sit up on top of the house and watch me. But what I was noticing out of that wasp nest, they were coming out of that wasp nest and they were going into the mustards where the cabbage worms or moths were living. So my theory was that, they would just come in and out of that mustard patch constantly. So, I don't feel like it's safe to say that we should eliminate the predator when they're also beneficial. So it can be scary, but everybody's got a place.
What about the tomato hornworm and there are predatory wasps that are actually really beneficial to keep the balance, sort of.
Yeah, and that one looks crazy because that wasp lay the eggs on the back of the tomato hornworm. So you'll have little eggs on the back of the worm, and when they hatch, that's their food source. So this worm's living its life with all of these eggs on its back. But yeah, that's an instance of, mustards will bloom through June. Your tomatoes are out there starting to crank away, and yeah, it could help for sure.
So the predatory wasps are definitely bad for the tomato hornworm. Let's see. Keith has a question. What cover will work well in semi-shade?
Semi-shade, your brassicas are going to do pretty good. Like your daikons and your radishes, turnips will do quite well. They might not get as large, and it depends on the amount of shade that you have too. But they'll work quite well in shade.
And Hallie has a question. You shared a picture of mustard and it looked as though it was planted in an ornamental garden setting with some pansies. Some of your photos showed wheat planted in the same way, where it was planted around a garden bench. Is it possible to use a diversity of cover crops within your ornamental gardening around your home over the fall and winter to improve the soil and water issues, not specifically targeted to grow vegetables?
Yes. And I would also defer you to Bree. I think it's Bree Arthur. Is that right, Dale? Yeah. I would refer you to Bree Arthur's books because she has wheat growing in her front yard and it's landscaped really well. Yeah, it looks really good. I think it looks good. As long as, you're not, for some reason, as long as the human eye can see straight lines, we approve of nature. But yeah.
I have a follow-up question for that. Are there any cover crops, if you choose to do that, that you may risk them getting out of control, and then in a season you're like, oh my gosh, why did I do this? Because because you mentioned some of them that you plant, was it rye? That some of them might have a tendency they might be difficult to terminate. So can you talk about that a little bit, if possible, within if you were planting it ornamentally or in your landscaping?
Yeah, I would definitely, if you're doing an ornamental landscape, I'd stay away from perennial rye, because that's the one that can get really, really tall and out of control. And you're going to have to do some digging to get that root ball up.
Yeah.
Another one's like Sudan grass. That one might get out of control.
Okay.
Trying to think what else, but like you're really safe with your brassicas because they're kind of tender, they're low growing, they tolerate poor soils. And oats are really good if you want to try a grass. They're kind of like the most tender of the wheat rye varieties.
Couldn't vetch get out of hand as well?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
As well as pea, but also too, like it's so tender, you can kind of like keep that in mind. If you're going to plant vetch or pea in the garden, then you might need to stay a little bit more on top of that and pull it out faster.
Okay.
Okay, that is the last question we have typed in. If anyone has any last questions, you can unmute and ask, or you can just unmute and tell Adam thank you.
Thank you, Adam. We all wish you well in your future endeavors. I think Kevin may chime in with something here.
Well, yeah, absolutely. Great Munch and Learn, and good luck. And we know we'll be seeing you plenty in the future.
Yeah, definitely. I definitely will not be a stranger, and it's bittersweet. It's hard to go, but
Thanks, Adam. Thanks, Adam, for all the information.
Thanks.
Yep. Thanks. Enjoyed it.
Yep, me too.
Thanks, Adam.
See it.
Thank you, Adam. That was great. I can't wait to send this recording to my daughter. She's very interested in soil.
Oh, nice. Yeah, did she ever get that book?
Yes.
Oh, good.
Yes, I
It's
got
a gateway book. Be careful.
Lily,
Yes, Joanne.
I want to ask this question. Will you have a speaker for Black History Month?
We have, we don't have a specific speaker for Black History Month, but we do have some great books this year in our book club. And one of them this month is Black Art, A Cultural History by Richard Powell. And then at the end of the year, we are having an exhibition, Black Artists in America. And we're going to have lots of good talks and reading during that exhibition also.
Okay. All right. So you couldn't get anybody for this month to be on your Munch and Learn?
No, I don't have anybody for this month, but we do have that book. So if you
I heard about that. I heard you say about the book. Put that in the chat. I'm gonna write it down. You're gonna put it in chat.
okay.
Thank you.
I hope it's okay if I ask one more question. Adam, if we're really interested in soil science and, the microbiome of the soil, do you mind sharing your email address if I email you asking for book recommendations or something? I'm a Tennessee Master Gardener intern, and when they did the section on soil science, I was like, oh my God, this is amazing. So I'm really interested in it, but I kind of feel like I'm shifting through a ton of information and trying to find the right books and resources. I wrote down some of the two names you gave for books, but Jeff Lowenfeld and then Mycorrhizal Planet. I wrote those down. So like the book that you just recommended and said it's like a gateway book, I would love to know what that book was. So
Yeah, that's Jeff Lowenfeld.
that
So
is
yeah, so I would start with teaming with microbes,
okay.
and then probably read teaming with fungi, and then move on to teaming with nutrients. Teaming with nutrients has a lot more chemistry in it, and it's kind of a tougher read, but it really kind of lays out how plants cycle nutrients within themselves.
Okay. Well, I will
But yeah,
check that out.
I'll put my email in the chat.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thanks, Adam. Thanks, Dale.
Adam.
Thanks.